Some fresh disaster is in store, a new strain of sorrow will be added to our woe. Such ceaseless thrills of terror never wrung my heart before. Oh, where, you Trojan maidens, can I find inspired Helenus or Cassandra, that they may read me my dream? For I saw a dappled hind mangled by a wolf's bloody fangs, torn from my knees by force in piteous wise. And this, too, filled me with affright. Over the summit of his tomb appeared Achilles' phantom, and for his guerdon he would have one of the luckless maids of Troy. Wherefore, I implore you, powers divine, avert this horror from my daughter, from my child. Hello, and welcome to the Euripides Fan Club Hour. I am your host, Liv, also known as the host of Let's Talk About Myths, Baby, ostensibly the real title of this podcast. Every time I've covered a play by Euripides on the podcast, I've become just a little bit more obsessed with him and his work than I was before. This isn't news, I talk about it far too often, but this month's series is, at least, my attempt to bridge the gap between the man and the plays themselves. As you've heard in the other episodes of this series, it is a very particular thing reading Greek tragedies. There are so many things happening at once. They are evidence of the mythological record that is often otherwise lost to us today. They are specific and structured pieces of contemporary classical reception, theatrical adaptations of pre-existing cultural traditions. They're political, veiled commentary on classical Athens and the Greek world of the 5th century BCE. And of course, they're stories of heartbreak and horror, of love and familial connection. And within all of that, there is also the mythological characters themselves, who were pre-existing, and what each tragedian's depiction says about not only that tragedian, but also the world around them. All of that is to say, today we're talking about some of the most interesting characters of Euripides, the women, who he wrote as complex, nuanced, flawed, realistic human beings. What a concept. And now I want to come up with something kind of like the Bechdel test, but with ancient tragedy. Like, do two named characters, neither of whom are aristocratic Greek men, speak to each other for longer than 200 lines? Then they pass the Euripides test. This is episode 276. I would gladly fight in battle 3 times over than give birth once. Women in Euripides. Guide these aged steps, my servants, forth before the house. Support your fellow slave, your queen of old, you maids of Troy. Take hold upon my aged hands, support me, guide me, lift me up, and I will lean upon your bended arm as on a staff, and quicken my halting footsteps onwards. O dazzling light of Zeus, O gloom of night, why am I thus scared by fearful visions of the night? O earth, dread queen, mother of dreams that flit on sable wings, I am seeking to avert the vision of the night, the sight of horror which I saw so clearly in my dreams, touching my son, who is safe in Thrace, and Polyxena, my daughter dear. You gods of this land, preserve my son, the last and only anchor of my house, now settled in Thrace, the land of snow, safe in the keeping of his father's friend. Some fresh disaster is in store, a new strain of sorrow will be added to our woe. Such ceaseless thrills of terror never wrung my heart before. Oh, where, you Trojan maidens, can I find inspired Helenus or Cassandra, that they may read me my dream? For I saw a dappled hind mangled by a wolf's bloody fangs, torn from my knees by force in piteous wise, and this, too, filled me with affright. Over the summit of his tomb appeared Achilles' phantom, and for his guerdon he would have had one of the luckless maids of Troy. Wherefore I implore you, powers divine, avert this horror from my daughter, from my child. Those were Hecuba's first lines from Euripides' play that's named for her. I haven't covered the Hecuba on the show yet, nor have I read it all myself, admittedly, but gods do I want to now! Hecuba, as you may remember, was the queen of Troy, wife of Priam, and mother of Hector, Paris, Cassandra, and as our most important for this play, another daughter, Polyxena, and a son, Polydorus. Euripides produced the Hecuba, Hecabe, in a more Greek transliteration, in 424 BC, about 7 years into the Peloponnesian War. The play revolves around Hecuba, queen of the fallen city of Troy, and how she deals with the death of most of her family. Specifically, though, how she deals with the death of the last two of her children, Polyxena and Polydorus, both of whom survived the war, but not this play. Polydorus' ghost opens the play, though his mother doesn't even know yet that he's dead. The play is about grief, motherly grief specifically, but it's also about revenge, a woman's revenge for wrongs committed against her children in the aftermath of war. And so because of that, we can't ignore this fact that it was produced about 6-7 years into the Peloponnesian War, a war that was pitting the pseudo-empires of Athens and Sparta against one another at the cost of so much of the wider ancient world. Those lines of Hecuba's that I just read, they might not open the play, but they ground us as the audience in what really matters. You know, the ghost of poor Polydorus, he's the one who has to open the play and explain to us that he's died, that he and his mother were betrayed. See, Hecuba believed that her son was on this ship bound for the safety of Thrace. She believed that she had at least one child who would live. So while it's Polydorus' ghost who opens the play to share this with us, that isn't the case, it's those first lines of Hecuba that really express what this play will be. A mother's love, grief, horror, and unquenchable thirst for revenge. I really wish I had time to read the entire play, so I had a better sense of just how impactful Euripides' work is in this case. But from what I've told you here, I think it's safe to assume that he was making some kind of statement with this grief-stricken, revenge-bound queen of fallen Troy and her chorus of enslaved Trojan women. It's likely that it was only a couple years earlier that Euripides had produced the Andromache, a play about Hecuba's daughter-in-law, the wife of Hector, and what she went through after the war, when she was taken by Achilles' son, Neoptolemus, as his prize of war. This is how the Andromache opens. O city of Thebes, glory of Asia, where on a day I came to Priam's princely home with many a rich and costly thing in my dower, engaged to Hector to be the mother of his children. I, Andromache, envied name in days of old, but now of all women that have been or yet shall be, the most unfortunate. For I have lived to see my husband Hector slain by Achilles, and our baby Astyanax, whom I bore to him, hurled from the towering battlements when the Hellenes sacked our Trojan home. And I myself am come to Hellas as a slave, though I was esteemed a daughter of a race most free, given to Neoptolemus, that island prince, and set apart for him as his special prize from the spoils of Troy. The Trojan War was, obviously, an incredibly common topic for playwrights to explore. It's like superheroes of today, only less obnoxious. There were countless stories to tell, and audiences were always interested in more. But that doesn't mean that we can or should write off all plays about the Trojan War as being explicitly about the Trojan War, or rather just that they had no other purpose that they could serve. With speeches like these from Andromache and Hecuba, like explicitly powerful women of Troy who were brought low by the Greeks and yet who retain their strength, their dignity, love, character, everything that you've just heard, despite the horror, it's no doubt a commentary also on the very real people, particularly women and children, who were suffering under the Peloponnesian War that was raging at the time. Athens suffered too, certainly, and in the end it did end up losing to Sparta, but I can't help but imagine that the people living within the city during much of the war, this city that had so much power and money, weren't faced with the same violence and horror that the people in cities on the periphery might have faced. Cities without the wealth of Athens. Cities who were just at the mercy of that wealth. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? Living in a place that is paying for one of the most horrific cases of mass murder of the last century, while the place itself remains safe and sound and full of propaganda-instilled fear in the so-called other. The year after Euripides produced the Hecuba, in 423, he produced another play about women living through the aftermath of a devastating war. This time, though, it wasn't the Trojan War, but the other most famous mythological war of the Greeks. The Seven Against Thebes. O Demeter, guardian of this Eleusinian land, and you servants of the goddess who attend her fane, grant happiness to me and my son Theseus, to the city of Athens and the country of Pythias, wherein my father reared me, Aethra, in a happy home, and gave me in marriage to Aegeus, Pandion's son, according to the oracle of Loxias. This prayer I make when I behold these aged women who, leaving their homes in Argos, now throw themselves with suppliant branches at my knees in their awful trouble. For around the gates of Cadmus have they lost their 7 noble sons, whom on a day Adrastus, king of Argos, led there, eager to secure for exiled Polynices, his son-in-law, a share in the heritage of Oedipus. So now their mothers would bury in the grave the dead, whom the spear has slain, but the victors prevent them, and will not allow them to take up the corpses, spurning heaven's laws. Those were the opening lines to Euripides' Suppliant Women. They were spoken by Aethra, mother of Theseus. This play, too, I haven't read or covered on the show yet, but still, like Hecuba, just a surface-level view makes pretty clear that, once again, Euripides is interested in exploring the grief and trauma of women, particularly in how they fare after their lives have been upended, even destroyed by war. I will cover this play eventually, but having glanced at the plot, I think it may be a different sort of example of this, but one that just holds its own value. Theseus seems to play heavily in this play, as does the democracy of Athens and more specific politics of the time, because remember, democracy apparently peaked 2,500 years ago, and we should never revisit whether or not the people are actually ruling. But this is happening alongside a chorus of mothers who've lost their sons in the war and who are championed by Aethra, Theseus' own mother. A story similar to this, though, of suppliants to Athens who were victims of war may have actually happened, too, and this play might have been mythologizing it, or vice versa. Honestly, either way, I think that having these issues covered in so many different ways only adds to the complexity of what Euripides might have been trying to do. I think he was just interested in drawing people's attention to issues of their time, alongside the entertainment that he was providing them. And I've said this before, but I'll say it again. I find this relatable, Euripides. Of course, depicting women like Hecuba, Andromache, and Aethra, these types of strong, aristocratic, morally sound women, aren't necessarily the most fascinating of Euripides. They're important, and I'm glad I've talked about them, only half because I now have so many more plays that I want to cover on the show, but they make up only a small portion of Euripides' women, in my eyes at least. These types of women, and I say types because these absolutely aren't the only examples in Euripides' work, they're important for emphasizing a type of woman who is often otherwise seen as, masculine or even patriarchal. I don't mean that literally, but just in terms of, these women take on roles that are meant to fall to men, and obviously, that makes them valuable. But there are so many other types of women in Euripides' work, and we don't even need to leave the horrors of war to find them. These are some of Cassandra's first coherent lines in Euripides' Trojan Women. O mother, crown my head with victor's wreaths, rejoice in my royal match, lead me to my lord. Nay, if you find me loth at all, thrust me there by force, for if Loxias be indeed a prophet, Agamemnon, that famous king of the Achaeans, will find in me a bride more fraught with woe to him than Helen, for I will slay him and lay waste his home, and avenge my father's and my brethren's death. But of the deed itself I will not speak, nor will I tell of that axe which shall sever my neck and the necks of others, or of the conflict ending in a mother's death, which my marriage shall cause, nor of the overthrow of Atreus' house, but I, for all my frenzy, will so far rise above my frantic fit, that I will prove this city happier far than those Achaeans, who, for the sake of one woman and one man's love of her, have lost a countless host in seeking Helen. Once more, with the Trojan Women, we have a work that is commenting on both the contemporary horrors of the Peloponnesian War and, I think, the broader concept of war and conquest. But I think it's easy to fall into the mindset that this type of criticism, commentary on the ruling order, is only meant to reference one terrible event within war rather than the larger concept itself. It's not relatable at all. As I've already told you about this play, it's possible, even likely, that Euripides had the siege of Melos in mind when he wrote the story of these Trojan women. But even if that was his intention, that doesn't mean that in doing so, the work isn't also a commentary on the wider practice of colonial violence. And I say this while watching how Israel is now allowed to bomb Lebanon, because the West won't actually stand up for any human lives unless they are from the West. From here, I'm happy to say we'll be veering off from war and its victims and into the realm of the morally questionable, but oh so fun. But on me has fallen this unforeseen disaster, and sapped my life. Ruined I am, and long to resign the boon of existence, kind friends, and die. For he who was all the world to me, as well you know, has turned out the worst of men, my own husband. Of all things that have life and sense, we women are the most hapless creatures. First must we buy a husband at a great price, and over ourselves a tyrant set, which is an evil worse than the first. And herein lies the most important issue, whether our choice be good or bad. For divorce is not honorable to women, nor can we disown our lords. Next must the wife, coming as she does to new ways and customs, since she has not learned the lesson in her home, have a diviner's eye to see how best to treat the partner of her life. If haply we perform these tasks with thoroughness and tact, and the husband live with us, without resenting the yoke, our life is a happy one. If not, it were best to die. But when a man is vexed with what he finds indoors, he goes forth and rids his soul of its disgust, betaking him to some friend or comrade of like age, while we must see only his own self. And yet they say we live secure at home, while they are at the wars, with their sorry reasoning. For I would gladly take my stand in battle array 3 times over, than once give birth. Medea. Those were some of Medea's first lines, and gods if they aren't some of the best ever. The end of that speech was, obviously, the inspiration for today's episode title. It's one of Medea's most iconic lines, and frankly, I've not read it often enough. But side note, I was Googling the Greek of this line, because tattoo, obviously, and ended up finding someone who paraphrased Medea's point here as, essentially, men fight with swords and women fight with childbirth, and I have never hated anything more. Like, that is simply not the fucking point of that line. Like, I'm not going to call this person out, but I will say that it was the only Google result that was obviously based in religious studies rather than historical. Just saying. Medea's speech here is conveying so much, and explicitly so much more than some trad femme bullshit nonsense. Medea is not saying that battle and childbirth are comparable. She is saying how deeply, completely incomparable they are. I don't want to suggest that Euripides was making some big feminist point here, like, for a few reasons, but I also think that he didn't need to. Like, I don't think Euripides was necessarily eager for major structural change in his society. I just think that he, at the most basic of levels, like, understood. Like, I think he understood, again, just at the most basic of levels, but the bar is in the ground, women, foreigners, and even at times enslaved people. He just understood that they were people. It might sound simplistic, but I think it might just be that simple. I think, at least in comparison to most others whose work survived, he generally understood humans to be equal in their capabilities for emotion, complexities, flaws. Like, I think he understood that women had the capacity for terrible, violent things or uncaring, emotionless things, and that didn't mean that all women were bad or good. I think he understood that foreigners or enslaved people weren't any less human than Athenian men. Does that mean he wanted some enormous structural change to grant these people equality in any way? I mean, I'd love it if he did, but I don't see the evidence for it. And that's okay. For me, I love him purely and completely because he gave us ancient women that seem like real people. And also, that raged against the patriarchy like Medea. But this does lead us beautifully into the ancient evidence for Euripides, the misogynist. But first, you have to hear some of Phaedra's first speech from Euripides' Hippolytus. Slightly abridged, relevant for where we're going. Women of treason who dwell here upon the frontier edge of Pelops' land, here often in heedless mood through the long hours of night, have I wondered why man's life is spoiled. And it seems to me their evil case is not due to any natural fault of judgment, for there be many dowered with sense, but we must view the matter in this light, by teaching and experience to learn the right, but neglect it in practice, some from sloth, others from preferring pleasure of some kind or other to duty. Now life has many pleasures, protracted talk and leisure, that seductive evil. Likewise, there is shame, which is of 2 kinds, one a noble quality, the other a curse to families. But if for each its proper time were clearly known, these 2 could not have had the self-same letters to denote them. For fain I would my virtue should to all appear, my shame have few to witness it. If I knew my sickly passion now, to yield to it I saw how infamous, and more, I learnt to know so well that I was but woman, a thing the world detests. Curses, hideous curses on that wife who first did shame her marriage vow for lovers other than her lord. It was from noble families this curse began to spread among our sex, for when the noble countenance disgrace poor folk, of course, will think that it is right. Those, too, I hate who make profession of purity, though in secret reckless sinners. How can these, Queen Cypris, Ocean's child, ever look their husbands in the face? Do they never feel one guilty thrill that their accomplice, night, or the chambers of their house will find a voice and speak? Oh, Phaedra. Phaedra. You might remember her as sister to Ariadne, princess of Crete, who is married off to Theseus long after he abandoned her sister on an island. And Phaedra, well, frankly, the Hippolytus is a play I'm very excited to cover pretty soon, and which also has some really prickly topics, which I couldn't easily explain here without spoiling it / concerning you that the play is something that it's not. So instead, for now, I will just say that Phaedra here is speaking of a terrible affliction of hers that becomes the plot of the play. She has an unnatural attraction to her stepson, Theseus's child, by the Amazon Hippolytus. That is the shame that she's speaking of here, and that is the shame, along with some action surrounding it, that leads to just one of the examples of how Euripides becomes tangled up in the web that is misogyny. For this we have to blame, to no one's surprise, the comedic playwright Aristophanes. In his play, which I covered a couple of years ago, the Thesmophoriazusae, The Women at the Festival, Aristophanes presents a cast of Athenian women who have some complaints about Euripides' craft. In this play, Euripides is described by one woman as, quote, "the man who has done so much harm, whom it pleases to put all the vile women that ever were upon the stage, who only shows us Melanippes and Phaedras, but of Penelope he has never said a word, because she was reputed chaste and good." And at this, the man working on behalf of Euripides to infiltrate this gathering of women, disguised as one himself, replies, quote, "I know the reason. It's because not a single Penelope exists among the women of today, but all, without exception, are Phaedras." And that's why I had to read the Phaedra bit. I've complained enough about Aristophanes in the episodes that I did on this play, but we can't talk about Euripides and women without looking at these moments. We have to keep in mind that this is comedy, and it's meant to be over the top, bawdy, and even ridiculous. And it may have been good-natured ribbing between friends, but regardless of how these lines were intended in Aristophanes' time, within a century or so, his plays were being used as biographical evidence of Euripides, the real man, of Euripides, the real misogynist. Even now, there are ripples of this, like anecdotes that Euripides hated women and that they hated him back. It's infused in all of the biographical stuff we have. Instead, though, I really think that these claims by Aristophanes end up providing even more proof that Euripides didn't love or hate women, that wasn't the point. He simply considered them just as human as men. And so really, it's Aristophanes' description of women that lack reality. They feel like the caricatures of how men sometimes see women. They're complaining, they're taking things too seriously, too personally. They're assuming that because he's depicted one woman who is bad, that means he considers them all that way. These, I think, are the real projections of what men believed women were up to. Aristophanes, as they say on Love Island, wants a woman who doesn't take themselves too seriously. But before we leave the women at the Thesmophoria, I have to read another passage because it's just too perfect to accompany these stories of interesting, realistic, compassionate, villainous, cursed women who serve as evidence not that women are inherently evil or adulterous or even good, just that they're inherently human. If I have asked to speak, may the goddesses bear me witness it was not for sake of ostentation, but I have long been pained to see us women insulted by this Euripides, this son of the green stuff woman, who loads us with every kind of indignity. Has he not hit us enough, calumniated us sufficiently, wherever there are spectators, tragedians, and a chorus? Does he not style us as adulterous, lecherous, bibulous, treacherous, and garrulous? Does he not repeat that we are all vice, that we are all the curse of our husbands? Back to their source, the holy rivers turn their tide. Order and the universe are being reversed. 'Tis men whose counsels are treacherous, whose oath by heaven is no longer sure. Rumor shall bring a change over my life, bring it into good repute. Honor's dawn is breaking for woman's sex. No more shall the foul tongue of slander fix upon us. The songs of the poets of old shall cease to make our faithlessness their theme. Phoebus, lord of minstrelsy, hath not implanted in our mind the gift of heavenly song, else had I sung an answering strain to the race of males, for time's long chapter affords many a theme on their sex as well as ours. With mind distraught did you your father's house desert on your voyage between ocean's twin rocks, and on a foreign strand you dwell, your bed left husbandless, poor lady, and you an exile from the land, dishonored, persecuted. Gone is the grace that oaths once had. Through all the breadth of Hellas honor is found no more. To heaven hath it sped away. For you no father's house is open. Woe is you, to be a haven from the troublous storm, while over your home is set another queen, the bride that is preferred to you. That was a choral song from the Medea. Just a slight scratch at the surface of Aristophanes' jokes about Euripides' character reveal just the hint of bullshit underneath. And again, this time I won't even blame Aristophanes, but instead later audiences' inability to recognize that he was joking. In Euripides' own works, he gives us a far more accurate sense of how he felt, even if we won't go so far as to say that he was explicitly empathetic to the plight of women in his time. He was very clearly aware of it and interested in how it affected their lives, the social dynamics of the culture more broadly. It's why he gives us choruses, like these Corinthian women of Medea who, though they never fully understand, have their own level of empathy for the choice that she was faced with, even when she is this murderous, barbarous, foreign woman. So often the choruses serve a purpose like this. They aren't always on the protagonist's side. Sometimes they're critical, sometimes empathetic, sometimes both. In many cases, they are, at least, also women themselves. Medea is surrounded by a chorus of Corinthian women. That they are Corinthian is vital to the story, but so is their being women, and understanding those parts of Medea's situation. A chorus of men could never. In Hecuba and the Trojan women, the choruses of Trojan women serve to emphasize the tragedy, the cost of the war, the human suffering. In Iphigenia, her chorus of enslaved Greek women serve a similar purpose. Only they will understand what she is dealing with. The same goes for Helen's chorus of captive women in the Helen, and Creusa's chorus of the same in the Ion. 18 of Euripides' plays survive for us today. 13 of those plays have choruses of women. And again, I don't bring this up just because representation matters, even though it does, but instead to emphasize that the choruses of women are not just women for the sake of being women. They serve within stories that explicitly require what they provide as women. By utilizing women as the sounding board and to move the story along, like the choruses often do, makes a point in itself. Whether it's about the emotions they elicit or the nature of their status as secondary to men. Regardless, it is providing this extra level of depth within the play. And I think Euripides was particularly interested in examining stories which were best interpreted by women for all of these reasons. even if he had to use a cast and chorus and even, for the most part, have an audience of exclusively men. I mean, what can you do? Oh, nerds. This episode was supposed to cover so many more bits and pieces, but then I found too many great quotes to read, and so here we are. We're not done with Euripides yet, though. Not that, I mean, I will ever be done, but I mean the series specifically. There's more to say, including some impiety, rumors of a cheating wife, and more. That's right. Lots of ancient gossip still to come. Thank you, Aristophanes. But until then, Saturday is International Podcast Day, and I'm going to be doing something a little special with a couple of podcast pals. I'm teaming up with the folks in Movies We Dig and Ancient History Fangirl to talk all things ancient world and its reception, but also we're going to do a live reading of the Bacchae, and it's the translation by Emma Pauley, also past guest on the show. Oh, it's going to be good. So we are going to be live streaming this at 1 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, and we'll be taking questions from listeners too, and those watching the stream. So check that out on Saturday. The link is in this episode's description. Also, one more update on the subscription options for anyone who's following along. While I believe I've sorted out the snags, the delay pushed it, honestly, so far that I just have to make the call to push things off a little longer, formally. So I'm moving across the country at the end of October, and also currently obsessed with reorganizing the entire podcast production process and hyperfixating on growing and changing everything, like in a really positive way. But it's also while I'm trying to move and also have episodes ready, like while I move. So like I'm feeling great, but also my brain is doing too many things. So the subscription and the new merch, all of those exciting things will come in November. For now, keep following the podcast Instagram. It's just Myths Baby, because that's where I'll be teasing everything that will be coming more officially, and we will actually have it all be prepared. I will have a place for you guys to submit your email if you're interested in hearing about it, so we can be collecting names and let everyone know when this is all ready. So, it's just, we're all going to get even more excited than we already are. Also, I'm moving to Toronto, so who knows? Maybe I will actually attempt live events in the future. We will see. For now, here's a review from one of you lovely listeners. This one is coming from a user called Caroline, but like with a 0 and a 1, from Norway. This is my favorite podcast. I'm not really a podcast person, but this one is amazing. It's super educational while still being really funny. Also, I love the feminist point of view. 10 out of 10. Thank you. Leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or comment on Spotify to be featured either in an episode like this or on my Instagram alongside the new Greek cat reviews. I'm also thinking of taking voice recordings, like voicemails from you guys. I think that could be fun. If you stayed long enough to hear this, tell me if you think that would be fun. Also, another episode of Hermes Historia is coming tomorrow. So much happening. They'll probably be free throughout October too, because we've got fun plans, and I'm not going to deny you all that just because the ad-free subscription part will be a little bit longer. So more teasers to get you really excited about that to come. Let's talk about Miss Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Pangawish is the Hermes to my Olympians, the amazing producer. Select music in this episode was by Luke Chaos. The podcast is part of the iHeart Podcast Network. Listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. I am Liv, and I love this shit. It's like I have this renewed love 7 years in. I think it's called just not being depressed anymore, but I highly recommend.